Welcome back, Detective. You found your quiet corner of the night. Where the lights are low, the air is still, and only the mysteries stay awake. Tonight's file carries a name the world has whispered for almost 2 decades. It's a story that began on a warm evening beside the Atlantic, a case that traveled through every headline, every living room, and still, after all this time, remains unfinished. This is Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly, for those who wander and for those who dream. It was May 3rd, 2007 in Praia da Luz, a quiet seaside village on Portugal's southern coast. Ocean air drifted through whitewashed villas. The night carried the scent of salt and flowering trees. At apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort, 3 children slept in twin beds under a gentle ceiling fan. Madeleine, almost 4 years old, and her younger brother and sister, twins still small enough to be lifted with one arm. Their parents, enjoying dinner with friends at a nearby restaurant, took turns checking on them. Every 20 or 30 minutes, the rhythm of a family on holiday, trusting the calm of a familiar place. Around 10 p.m., Madeleine's mother returned for another quiet check. She pushed open the patio door, expecting to hear the small, even breath of sleeping children. Instead, the room felt colder. A window stood open, a curtain moved in the breeze, and one bed was empty. Her call for help carried through the resort, and within minutes, the small holiday complex awoke. Neighbors with flashlights, staff searching gardens and pathways, voices echoing through the narrow lanes that led down to the beach. By midnight, local police had arrived. They questioned guests, sealed entrances, and began a house-to-house search that spread outward through the town. Helicopters would later sweep the coastline. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder through empty lots and scrubland. As dawn touched the water, there was still no sign of the missing child. Only the sound of the sea and the distant clatter of shutters opening. The start of another day in a place that would never feel the same again. The first light of May 4th slid across the terracotta rooftops of Praia da Luz. Police cars idled near the Ocean Club. Officers moved quietly between buildings, speaking in low voices, careful not to wake the younger twins still sleeping inside. Volunteers gathered outside the resort, tourists, locals, staff from nearby shops, each handed photocopied sheets bearing a small smiling photograph. The picture showed a 3-year-old with fair hair, bright eyes, and a distinctive mark in one iris that would become instantly recognizable worldwide. Search teams expanded in every direction. They combed cliffs above the Atlantic, swept through abandoned farm buildings and drainage tunnels, and checked border crossings and marinas. Within hours, the alert reached Interpol and British authorities. The case had crossed borders before the sun had fully risen. At the local police station, statements were taken, timelines compared. Officers reconstructed the evening in careful minutes. Who checked the apartment, when the window was last seen closed, how long the doors had been unlocked. Everything ordinary became evidence, every sound or movement a question to be answered. For the next several days, the search continued almost without pause. Helicopters flew patterns over the town. Sniffer dogs worked through alleys and scrubland. Officers in reflective vests moved through fields in parallel lines. The sound of radios and the crunch of boots on gravel filled spaces that were once quiet holiday paths. The Portuguese Polícia Judiciária, joined by British liaison officers, began documenting every lead. Sightings called in from nearby towns, from service stations, from travelers certain they had glimpsed a child matching the description. Each report was logged, checked, and, when nothing confirmed, set aside. Within a week, news crews arrived. Satellite vans lined the narrow streets, their lights turning night into daylight again. Microphones caught the sea wind, and the case of one missing child became an international story. The parents made a public appeal, speaking through fatigue and disbelief, asking anyone who knew anything to come forward. Across Europe, newspapers printed the same photograph on their front pages. The world had seen her face, and the search had become something far larger than the small town where it began. As May passed into June, investigators mapped every hour of that evening. They collected fingerprints, fibers, and witness accounts, sent evidence to laboratories, compared results, and waited for clarity that did not come. Forensic work moved carefully. Communication between Portuguese and British teams sometimes blurred with translation and differing procedure. Rumors filled the gaps that facts could not yet occupy. But inside the official case file, the work remained steady. Pages of interviews, lists of recovered items, grids of search coordinates. Weeks became months. Summer visitors returned to the Algarve's beaches, but in Praia da Luz, posters still hung in shop windows, edges curling in the heat. Locals spoke of the search as if it had entered the rhythm of the town. Morning tides, evening news, the name always present. By early autumn 2007, the first phase of the investigation was slowing. Evidence had been gathered, analyzed, discussed, and yet no single answer had emerged. The mystery that began in one apartment now spanned continents, drawing in hundreds of officers and millions of watchful eyes. The case was no longer only a local search. It had become a question the whole world was asking, and no one yet could answer. As the months passed, the search for answers grew beyond the quiet streets of Praia da Luz. Detectives from Portugal worked alongside British police, and specialists flown in from London. Files crossed borders, translations multiplied. Every scrap of evidence, every footprint, every witness statement was logged, copied, and re-examined. In London, government liaisons coordinated communication with Portugal, while volunteers across Europe organized awareness campaigns. Airports displayed her photograph on information screens. Airlines carried missing child posters in seat pockets. For a moment, the world seemed united by one small face and a single question. But time, as it does, softened the edges of urgency. Leads faded, new ones appeared, many impossible to verify. The case drew enormous media attention. News bulletins updated daily, tabloids speculated, and the simple facts were often drowned beneath the weight of rumor. Investigators returned again and again to the same documents, to the same photographs of the apartment, to the same unanswered spaces in the timeline. The search became less about finding a person and more about understanding a sequence of moments. What was certain, what could never be certain again. In 2008, formal inquiries in Portugal paused, and the official case file was archived with the note that it could be reopened if significant new evidence were to appear. For the family and for British authorities, the work continued privately. Teams of retired officers and hired investigators reviewed the material, cross-referenced travel records, and built databases of every reported sighting across Europe and beyond. From time to time, hope would flare, a report from a distant city, a photograph that seemed familiar, but each was checked, and each, in the end, disproved. Years moved quietly. The case never closed in public memory. It became part of modern history's catalogue of unanswered questions. Television documentaries revisited the events. Books and interviews sought to untangle what was known. Yet amid all the noise, the original purpose, the search for one missing child, remained unchanged. By 2011, a new review began under Scotland Yard, formerly known as Operation Grange. It aimed to re-evaluate every element of the investigation from the beginning: evidence storage, forensic samples, witness testimony, all re-examined with updated methods. Hundreds of pieces of information were catalogued anew. Digital analysis allowed old photos and phone records to be reviewed with tools unavailable in 2007. Officers worked methodically, cross-checking travel documents and satellite data, tracing timelines of everyone present in and around the resort that week. The effort was quiet, disciplined, persistent, and though no decisive answer appeared, it ensured the file remained alive, a living investigation rather than a closed chapter. Meanwhile, the story had become something larger than any one case. It changed how families viewed child safety while traveling, how resorts managed evening childcare, how governments coordinated missing person alerts abroad. In classrooms, children learned her name as part of lessons on awareness. In airports, new systems of identification were tested. A tragedy had reshaped procedure. For the family, each passing anniversary brought vigils and renewed appeals. The photograph remained the same, a small girl smiling toward the camera, eyes bright, sunlight on her shoulders. Years moved, but that image did not. As the second decade since her disappearance approached, investigations would be reopened more than once, sometimes after new information, sometimes after public pressure. Each time, detectives reread the file, looking for something small that might have been missed. And still, the question lingered over every page. What happened that night in Praia da Luz? There are cases that fade quietly into archives, and there are cases that remain suspended, not for want of effort, but because the fragments of fact refuse to join into a single picture. This is one of those. The world moved on, but the case of Madeleine McCann never truly left the world's attention. The years moved quietly. In Praia da Luz, the white buildings faded a little under the Atlantic wind. The palms along the seafront swayed as they always had. For the people who had lived through those first frantic days, time brought a kind of muted routine, but the memory of that night lingered like salt in the air. In Britain, the official review known as Operation Grange continued. Officers built detailed chronologies, followed hundreds of leads, and coordinated with Portuguese counterparts as evidence was re-examined. Files traveled between London and Lisbon, each journey a reminder that this case still breathed. Public interest rose and ebbed, yet every few years a new clue or forensic test would draw attention back. DNA techniques improved, old phone records were reanalyzed with modern mapping tools, and the network of investigators remained in quiet contact. Sometimes a fresh name or location would enter the file, a possibility that brought both hope and restraint. Every new step was checked with care, the goal not simply to close the case, but to be certain. 2 decades on, Madeleine's disappearance remains one of the most widely investigated cases in modern history. Across those years, her family and the investigating authorities have released periodic statements, acknowledging progress, expressing gratitude for continued information, and asking that speculation be set aside in favor of fact. It is an investigation still open, still active in both the United Kingdom and Portugal as of 2025. Detectives continue to work, sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, returning to the same essential purpose: to learn the truth of what happened to a child who should have been safe in her bed. For the rest of us, the story stands as both caution and reminder. It speaks of how swiftly an ordinary evening can change, and how vast the response of strangers can be when compassion meets uncertainty. It also shows how mystery endures, how even in an age of satellites, databases, and digital footprints, some questions remain just beyond our reach. When you trace the timeline now, the resort, the window, the search, the years of investigation, it feels less like a single night, and more like a constellation of moments scattered across time, each piece of evidence a small, distant light. Some connect, others flicker alone. Together, they form the outline of a mystery that continues to move just ahead of certainty. There is sadness here, yes, but also endurance. The endurance of those who keep looking, of officers who still reopen old boxes of evidence, of neighbors who still pause when they hear her name. A search that lasts this long becomes part of collective memory, woven quietly into how we think about safety, family, and loss. And so, as of tonight, the file remains open. The pages are worn but not forgotten. Somewhere, a small photograph still rests on a desk, and a light stays on in an evidence room, waiting for the clue that will one day close the story. Until then, we hold space for the unanswered, because every mystery, however heavy, asks us to remember that searching is an act of care. Take a slow breath with me now. The rain outside has softened. The night has thinned. The questions can rest for a while. In this room of quiet evidence, we've walked through a story still unfolding, where every detail is handled with patience and respect. There are no monsters here, only people, and the spaces between what is known and what is not. Let that awareness ease you. The mind does not need every answer to find peace. Sometimes it only needs the permission to stop asking for a moment. Breathe in slowly and let it go. Feel the room settle around you, the steady rhythm of rain against the window, the hush that follows when questions sleep. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly, for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning. It was May 25th, 1979. In the Soho district of New York City, the sun was already spilling down narrow streets lined with cast-iron lofts. 7-year-old Etan Patz buttoned a blue jacket, pulled on a backpack decorated with small cartoon pins, and told his mother he could walk the 2 short blocks to his school bus stop by himself. It was a simple request, the kind that marks a small step toward independence. The route was familiar, the distance short. He left the apartment a few minutes after 8 a.m., his father still upstairs, his mother watching from the window for a moment before turning back to the day's routine. On that corner, Prince Street and West Broadway, the morning bustle had already begun. Delivery trucks idling, shopkeepers lifting gates, the city stretching into another ordinary Friday. And somewhere within those minutes between home and bus stop, the trail of a little boy quietly ended. By afternoon, when he hadn't returned from school, the realization spread through the building floor by floor, calls to neighbors, then to the school, and finally to police. The search began that evening. Officers moved through basements and loading docks. Volunteers covered lamp posts with fresh photographs. The city's constant noise, the hiss of steam, the rumble of trains, suddenly sounded different, as though listening for an answer. Through the night, patrol cars traced the same few blocks again and again. No trace. No witness who could say, with certainty, they'd seen him after the corner. When dawn came, posters were already printed. A small school portrait showing a boy with bright eyes and a gentle, almost shy smile. That image would soon travel farther than anyone could have imagined. The search widened. Subway stations, alleys, rooftops. Soho was still a neighborhood in transition then, part industrial, part residential, a maze of lofts, workshops, and narrow stairwells. Each door opened became another question, each unanswered call, another echo. As the second day faded into the third, police began coordinating with federal authorities, an unusual step for a single missing child case in that era. There was no national database yet, no standardized alert system, no digital network to share photographs instantly. Everything depended on printed flyers, phone calls, and word of mouth. In that absence of technology, the city itself became the instrument of search. Hundreds of hands taping posters to poles, thousands of eyes scanning crowds on subway platforms. And in the middle of that vast, impatient city, one family waited by a phone that rarely stopped ringing. They could not know it then, but this single disappearance would change how an entire nation thought about its children and about the spaces between home and the wider world. By the second day, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. The news of a missing child in Manhattan spread through radio bulletins, then to the evening television broadcasts that reached every borough. New Yorkers, accustomed to noise and movement, paused when they saw the small photograph held up beside an anchor's desk. At first, it was just another local story, one of the dozens the city carried each week. But something about this one caught and held. Perhaps it was the ordinariness of it, a familiar street, a familiar morning. Perhaps it was the portrait, a gentle smile, bright eyes, a child who looked like every child. Hundreds of officers from the New York City Police Department joined the search. They retraced the route from the Patz apartment to the bus stop, knocking on doors, checking storage basements and elevator shafts, interviewing shop owners and truck drivers who had passed through the area that morning. Dogs trained in scent work combed the blocks around Prince and Worcester streets. Forensic specialists dusted doorknobs and banisters, though the technology of the time could not yet capture the faint traces we expect today. Helicopters scanned the Hudson River. Divers checked drainage outlets and docks. From rooftops, volunteers looked down at the lattice of fire escapes and alleyways, hoping for any sign, any small object that might guide the search. Inside the Patz family apartment, the kitchen table filled with notepads and coffee cups, friends and neighbors answering phones, taking messages from anyone who thought they might have seen something. The lines between private life and public appeal dissolved almost overnight. Within a week, Etan's photograph appeared in every newspaper in New York. The Times, the Post, the Daily News all carried his face above fold. And for once, the city's competing voices seemed to share the same language. Find him. The FBI joined the case, marking one of the first times federal agents had assisted in a local missing child investigation. Flyers were printed in the thousands, distributed to airports and bus terminals across the eastern seaboard. In an age before email or social media, the image of one missing child began to travel faster than the world had ever seen. But days turned to weeks without a breakthrough. Each potential lead, a call from a passerby, a sighting on a train, a rumor whispered at a payphone, led investigators farther from the truth. None held. Summer came, and the streets of Soho filled again with artists, workers, and schoolchildren. But for one family, time had divided itself into before and after. The search continued quietly, with detectives checking storage buildings long closed for the season, and family friends walking the same routes simply to feel they were doing something. As weeks became months, the case grew to symbolize something larger. Not only the loss of one child, but a collective awareness that modern cities had grown too complex, too fast for old assumptions of safety. Media coverage brought national attention, and with it, public discussions about child security and law enforcement coordination. Editorials asked whether the country needed a better system, a way to share photographs quickly, to alert communities beyond a single neighborhood. From the grief of one family, the blueprint for future action began to form. In 1983, 4 years after that morning walk, the United States officially recognized May 25th, the day Etan vanished, as National Missing Children's Day. It was a memorial, yes, but also a commitment, a promise that every lost child would be seen and sought with the same urgency. The same year, new campaigns emerged. Photographs of missing children printed on milk cartons, letters from families asking the public to look closely at the faces that might otherwise blur into everyday life. The first of those milk cartons carried Etan's picture. Millions of breakfast tables became, in their own way, part of the search. Though years had passed, his name still opened news bulletins, still lingered in classrooms and community halls. Even without an answer, the story continued to shape how a nation responded to loss. The case remained open, and detectives revisited it again and again as new methods of investigation developed. Fingerprint databases, DNA technology, psychological profiling. Each advancement another attempt to illuminate the shadows of 1979. But for a long time, the file stayed thin, waiting for a voice, for a confession that might one day fill its pages. The city carried on. The corner of Prince Street and West Broadway changed. Cafes replaced warehouses, and the hum of delivery trucks gave way to evening traffic and conversation. Yet for those who remembered, every step past that intersection still felt a little slower. The story of Etan Patz had become part of the city itself, etched quietly into the rhythm of its streets. The 1980s slid by in gray-toned photographs and faded newspaper clippings. The face that once appeared on milk cartons grew older only in the imagination of those who kept the photo on their fridge doors. Police followed hundreds of leads, most thin, many mistaken, some painfully false. For the Patz family, time became measured in anniversaries, each May 25th a marker of both absence and resolve. They spoke to reporters when necessary, but mostly lived quietly, choosing to keep their son's story alive through advocacy and education rather than headlines. Detectives changed posts, new ones took their place, yet the file remained within reach of every commanding officer who entered the Soho precinct. Occasionally, someone would pull the box from storage, spread its contents across a desk, and wonder if modern techniques might reveal something the original search had missed. By the 1990s, child safety programs born from the case had become routine. Neighborhood watch groups, photo alerts, school lectures, all part of a national pattern that did not exist before Etan. His absence had quietly rewritten how society looked after its young. Still, for investigators, the core mystery remained. A short walk, a single corner, then nothing. Every new generation of officers inherited the same question, and every answer ended in the same silence. 2 decades after his disappearance, a familiar pattern emerged. Someone confessed, another suspect was interviewed, then evidence fell short. The family endured each renewed wave of attention with measured hope, always returning to the quiet work of awareness. In 2001, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office formally re-examined the case. Old files were digitized, witness statements transcribed and scanned, physical evidence preserved for DNA testing. Nothing definitive surfaced, but the act of review itself breathed life back into the records. A decade later, in 2010, a new investigative team took up the file again, this time with modern forensics and renewed public interest. The city had changed beyond recognition. Cafes and galleries stood where warehouses once were. But beneath that modern surface, the memory of a child's walk to the bus stop still whispered through the streets. In 2012, detectives returned to a basement on Prince Street that had been searched decades earlier. Ground-penetrating radar was used, soil tested, but no trace was found. Then, in the months that followed, an old name resurfaced. A man who had once worked near the bus stop and spoken of the case with uneasy familiarity. The re-examination was cautious, driven by forensic procedure rather than speculation. Investigators sought corroboration, witness statements, and physical links that could withstand the weight of time. In 2017, after years of renewed investigation and court proceedings, a man was convicted for the kidnapping and murder of Etan Patz. It was a verdict built on careful legal work, decades of review, and the endurance of one family's resolve to keep the case alive. The conviction brought a measure of closure, not the return of what was lost, but a formal recognition of truth. For investigators and citizens alike, it marked the moment when a chapter long held open could finally be set down with care. Yet even with the verdict, the story's larger meaning remained. Etan's name had already changed law, culture, and awareness. His case had become a foundation for how the nation responds when a child goes missing. And in that legacy, his presence endures. Now, decades later, each May 25th is observed as National Missing Children's Day. Candlelight vigils, school assemblies, televised announcements, all quietly carry his memory. Parents walk their children to school and say goodbye at the corner, often without knowing that this simple ritual of care was once the subject of a nation's grief. The streets of Soho are different now, brighter, busier, safer perhaps, but beneath the layers of paint and time, the echo of that morning walk remains. The case of Etan Patz begins with one small decision on an ordinary morning and stretches across generations of investigators, parents, and laws. Every decade added a new layer, new science, new memory, new purpose. The final verdict in the courtroom offered a kind of answer, yet the story remains larger than any conviction. It is woven into the city itself, into the way a community learned to see its children, and into the systems that now respond when even one child vanishes. When you stand on Prince Street today, you hear a different city. Cafes humming, cars easing through the intersection. If you listen beneath that, you can almost sense the echo of an earlier morning. Footsteps on the pavement, a paper bag rustling, a child's voice blending with the sounds of trucks and pigeons. Time has continued its patient work, smoothing edges, repainting walls, but the air there still carries a hush that people can't quite name. Etan's story changed the shape of awareness, the posters, the milk cartons, the shared photograph. They were new tools in 1979. Now we have digital alerts that reach across entire regions in seconds, each one a small act of remembrance for the case that first taught the world how quickly a face could be lost and how powerful a community can be when it refuses to forget. For the officers who stayed with the file, the long pursuit of truth was a lesson in endurance. For the family, it became a lifelong commitment to helping others find their missing children, a way of turning grief into light for someone else's search. And for the rest of us, it is a reminder that behind every headline is a real home, a kitchen table with a phone waiting to ring. Stories like this never fully leave us. They settle into the public heart, part warning, part memory, part quiet hope. They ask us to look closer, to notice, to care. The work that began with one disappearance still ripples outward, saving lives that will never know his name, all because a city refused to let silence have the final word. So tonight, as the rain steadies outside your window, think of that small photograph that once traveled the country, printed in ink, carried in pockets, taped to storefront glass. A picture that asked a simple question, have you seen this child? And because of that question, thousands of others were found. Take a slow breath now. Let the story settle somewhere gentle in your thoughts. What remains is not only sadness, but a testament to compassion, the quiet work of countless strangers who searched, called, printed, hoped. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly, for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning. It was Sunday, September 5th, 1982. The sky was a deep, pre-sunrise gray, and most of the neighborhood still slept. 12-year-old Johnny Gosch pulled on a red jacket, tied his sneakers, and stepped outside with his dog, Gretchen, at his side. He loaded the wagon with copies of the Des Moines Register, folding them with practiced precision. It was a ritual he'd done many weekends before, his parents still half asleep, the world quiet except for the hum of insects and the far-off sound of a car. Sometime between 6 or and 6:15 a.m., neighbors would later recall seeing Johnny talking to a man in a blue car, a stranger asking for directions. Moments later, another neighbor noticed the wagon standing alone, papers neatly stacked, Gretchen barking nearby. Johnny was gone. When he didn't return home by 7 a.m., his father retraced the route, expecting to find him chatting with friends or helping another carrier. Instead, he found the empty wagon, the dog trembling beside it. By mid-morning, the family called police. At that time, the idea of a child abduction in suburban Iowa seemed unthinkable, unfit for reality. Officers suggested he might have run away or been delayed, But as hours passed, neighbors formed search lines through backyards and fields, and parents across the city began watching their own children differently. By evening, the local news carried the story. Paperboy missing in West Des Moines. His photograph, a school picture, appeared on screen for the first time. The headline would never truly leave the city again. The next morning, hundreds of volunteers combed streets and creeks. Helicopters hovered low, reporters filmed from intersections. In a town where little ever changed, the air itself felt altered, a mix of disbelief and something colder, awareness. Days became weeks. Leads arrived, none confirmed. Witness sketches were drawn, cars were traced and dismissed, rumors stretched beyond the state line. No trace of the boy who had left home before sunrise, his wagon still waiting for him to return. The case would soon grow beyond West Des Moines, linking with others, influencing law, and giving rise to movements that would reshape a nation's understanding of safety. That small wagon, left standing on a quiet street, became the symbol of an entire era's loss of innocence. Morning slipped into afternoon, then into night. Every minute that passed without news deepened the unease spreading through West Des Moines. Neighbors left porch lights burning. Volunteers carried flashlights and radios, searching ditches, parking lots, and fields beyond the suburban grid. For the Gosch family, the hours blended into one long moment of disbelief. Noreen and John, his parents, called every local agency, begging for urgency in the search. But in 1982, procedures for missing children were still uncertain, and the concept of an organized national response had not yet taken shape. In those first critical hours, officers treated the disappearance as a possible runaway case, a routine step back then before the lessons of later years. No Amber Alerts, no shared national database, no digital coordination, just phone trees, bulletin boards, and community word of mouth. By the second day, local media amplified the family's pleas. Photographs of Johnny, smiling in a collared shirt, appeared on television screens across Iowa. Soon, reporters from outside the state began to arrive, turning quiet suburban streets into temporary newsrooms. The search widened, stretching to rural roads and nearby counties. Police walked shoulder to shoulder through cornfields. Canine teams scoured abandoned lots, and hundreds of volunteers combed the edges of rivers. Each evening, hope ebbed and returned with the same rhythm as the rain. Weeks turned into months. No confirmed sightings, no new evidence. Only rumors, sketches, and whispers from distant states, none verified, none certain. But something larger began to stir. The Gosch family refused to let the search fade. They organized press conferences, printed flyers, and urged lawmakers to recognize the gap between what families needed and what law enforcement had been given to act with. Johnny's mother, Noreen, would later testify before committees, her voice steady, explaining how families needed national coordination, how every missing child should be treated as an emergency from the start. Her persistence became the quiet engine of change. In homes across America, parents watched the coverage, and the question formed, if this could happen there, could it happen here? The disappearance of a paperboy in Iowa began to alter how millions of families thought about safety and trust. By 1984, 2 years after Johnny's disappearance, the United States founded the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It was a direct response to cases like Johnny's and Etan Patz's before him, a recognition that missing children were not isolated tragedies, but part of a larger system that needed reform. In the years that followed, Johnny's name joined that growing list of faces printed on milk cartons, mailed to schools, grocery stores, and post offices. Each photograph a small act of collective vigilance, a promise to keep looking. The campaign became a symbol of both awareness and sorrow. Parents across the country checked the sides of their milk cartons while pouring cereal for their children, each breakfast carrying a reminder of those still missing. The Gosch family's search never ended. They held vigils, maintained hotlines, followed every lead. And though certainty never arrived, Their persistence changed how the world responded to others in similar pain. Through their voice, laws shifted. States implemented Johnny Gosch laws, requiring police to act immediately when a child was reported missing. No waiting period, no hesitation. From that small street in Iowa, a movement had begun, one that would save lives for decades to come. And yet, for Johnny himself, the mystery remained. No trace, no final answer, only theories and stories that grew in the absence of fact. But amid that uncertainty, something undeniable emerged. A community's compassion turned into national change. The wagon that once stood on a quiet street became the starting point of a new era, a symbol of both fear and progress, grief and determination, loss and legacy intertwined. The boy was gone, but the world had changed because of him. The disappearance of Johnny Gosch was never just one family's heartbreak. It became a turning point, a moment when an entire nation realized that a child could vanish not only from a street, but from the network of systems meant to protect them. From that small neighborhood in Iowa, waves of change spread outward, first to local police departments, then to state legislatures, and finally to Congress. Protocols were rewritten, awareness campaigns launched, and the phrase "missing child" took on a meaning it had never carried before. Decades later, the official record still lists Johnny Gosch as missing. His photograph remains in databases, his name still used in training manuals and law courses that teach investigators how to act quickly. There have been claims and fragments of stories, but none confirmed, none able to replace the silence of that September morning. The mystery endures, but so does the purpose it left behind. Because of this one child, thousands of others have been found faster, their families spared the same long waiting. For those who work the case, the memory is a lesson in vigilance. For his parents, it became a lifelong campaign for awareness and reform. And for the rest of us, it is a reminder that compassion can be built from loss, that a single family's refusal to give up can reshape how a country protects its children. If you drive through West Des Moines today, the street where Johnny once delivered newspapers looks ordinary again. Trees older, houses repainted, the hum of early traffic much the same as it was in 1982. But for those who remember, the sight of a paperboy pedaling through the dawn still carries an echo of that unanswered question: what became of the boy with the red jacket and the loyal dog who waited for him to return? Stories like this stay with us not because of fear, but because they reveal how quickly the ordinary can change, and how deeply people can care for someone they've never met. Each improvement in law, each alert that flashes across a phone screen, is, in some quiet way, part of Johnny's legacy. So tonight, as the rain fades outside your window, let the story settle into its rightful place. Not only a mystery, but a message. That every lost voice deserves to be searched for, and every unanswered call deserves to be heard. Take a slow breath now. Let the questions rest. The night is long enough for both grief and hope. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly, for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning. It was January 13th, 1996, in Arlington, Texas. The air was cool and still, the kind of winter day where the sunlight feels thin but kind. 9-year-old Amber Hagerman rode her pink bicycle with her little brother, Ricky, circling their grandparents' block again and again. They'd been told to stay close, to keep the ride short and within sight. They laughed as children do, free of the careful watch of the world, pedaling fast, turning corners, feeling the wind as an adventure. When Ricky turned back toward home, Amber went a little farther, down the quiet stretch of Abrams Street, where an old grocery store parking lot opened wide to the sky. There were houses nearby, a few cars passing, nothing unusual for a Saturday afternoon. But in the space of a few minutes, an ordinary moment became a story that would never truly end. A witness later told police he'd seen a man in a black pickup truck. A sudden movement, a child's bicycle left on the pavement, and the truck speeding away. By the time neighbors ran to the scene, the parking lot was empty except for that small pink bike lying on its side, its wheels still spinning. Police arrived within minutes. Amber's family searched every street, calling her name into the cold air. Officers interviewed witnesses, traced tire marks, and set up roadblocks through the surrounding area. As night fell, searchlights swept across creeks and vacant lots. Volunteers gathered at churches and schools, organizing search teams that moved through the night with flashlights and hope. The story reached television screens by evening, and by morning it had become national news. America, still remembering the disappearances of children like Etan Patz and Johnny Gosch, was suddenly reminded how fragile the space between safety and loss could be. For the next few days, the search continued without pause, dogs, helicopters, and officers working in shifts. But when answers finally came, they brought heartbreak rather than relief. Amber's life had been taken, and a community's sense of security vanished with it. In the sorrow that followed, a question began to take shape. How could the world respond faster next time? How could a community warn every driver, every citizen, within minutes instead of hours? That question would lead to an idea that would one day circle the globe. Out of that grief, something remarkable began. A network born from compassion and urgency, built to make sure no child vanished unheard again. In the weeks after Amber's disappearance, the town of Arlington moved carefully through its grief. Her school left an empty desk by the window. Flowers gathered at the base of the telephone pole near the parking lot, and neighbors who had known one another for years now spoke in hushed voices about how quickly safety could vanish. Television crews covered the story for days, not out of curiosity, but out of a sense that something needed to change. People asked the same question over and over. Why couldn't the community have been alerted the moment the pickup truck sped away? Among those who asked was a local woman named Diana Simone. She didn't know the Hagerman family personally, but she knew the feeling that gripped the neighborhood, that helpless, watching silence. She called a Dallas radio station and suggested an idea. What if broadcasters could interrupt music and news the instant a child was abducted, sharing the description, the vehicle, the direction of travel, a community alarm, not through sirens, but through voices? Her call sparked conversations among law enforcement, radio networks, and public safety officers. They realized the technology already existed, a system of emergency broadcast interruptions used for weather alerts and civil defense. What if those same frequencies were used for missing children? The idea grew quickly. Within months, police and broadcasters in the Dallas-Fort Worth area tested the first version of what would become known as the Amber Alert, named in honor of Amber Hagerman. It wasn't only a tribute, it was a promise. The system was simple in design, but profound in impact. When a child was reported abducted and details were verified, a description of the child and suspect vehicle would be transmitted instantly across every participating radio and television station. Drivers on highways, clerks in stores, families at breakfast, all would hear the same message at once. It turned every ear into a witness, every driver into part of the search. The first Amber Alerts led to immediate recoveries. Communities that once felt powerless discovered that vigilance could be shared. Word spread from Texas to Oklahoma, then across the country, and by the early 2000s, the system had been adopted in every U.S. state. With time, the alerts reached phones, freeway billboards, public transport screens, and even gaming consoles. Wherever there was a signal, there could be a voice saying, "Watch for this child." Each alert carried the weight of Amber's story, a reminder of what had been lost, and why the system existed at all. In less than a generation, thousands of children were found because of those few seconds of interruption. A sound on a car radio, a flash on a phone, and a life brought safely home. For Amber's family, the years that followed were filled with advocacy. They worked with legislators, attended memorials, and spoke with families who'd been helped by the alert system. Through their grief, they had built something that would outlive tragedy. A network made not of technology alone, but of people willing to care. In Arlington, a small park now bears her name. Children ride their bikes there, and every spring the trees bloom above the path that traces the edge of the neighborhood she once knew. The sound of those wheels on pavement, that simple, ordinary rhythm, is perhaps the most fitting memorial. Amber Hagerman's story is one of sorrow, but also of transformation. A small community's heartbreak reshaped how an entire world responds to danger. What began on a single neighborhood street in Arlington has become a network that stretches across continents, carried through satellites, cell towers, and radio waves, a call to attention that no one ignores. Each time an Amber alert sounds, it carries her name, not as a headline or a warning, but as an act of remembrance. It says that one child's story mattered enough to change the outcome for thousands of others. In every region that uses the system, whether called Amber or Child Alert or Code Adam, the principle remains the same: to unite people in the first crucial minutes after a child disappears, to make the world, if only for a moment, one neighborhood looking out for its own. If you trace the history of missing child advocacy, you'll find her name beside others: Etan Patz, Johnny Gosch, Jacob Wetterling, each story linked by the same quiet thread. Out of grief, awareness grows. Out of tragedy, protection strengthens. For investigators and families alike, Amber's legacy is a reminder of how quickly loss can become purpose. Each successful alert, each reunion captured by a phone notification or television scroll, is another echo of the promise that began with her. And somewhere in Arlington, the park that bears her name stays alive with the sounds of laughter, the rush of bicycle wheels through puddles after rain. It's an image of what her family fought to preserve, the simple, unguarded joy of a child at play. We remember her not for the cruelty of that day, but for what followed, the voices that rose together, the system that keeps rising still. It is proof that from the smallest corner of the world, from one child's story, compassion can ripple endlessly outward. Take a slow breath now. Let the rain guide you back to calm. The stories of loss we tell here are not to haunt, but to honor, to remember what was learned, what was changed, and what will not be forgotten. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly, for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning. It was September 20th, 1988, in the small town of Belen, New Mexico, a quiet community surrounded by mesas and open sky. 19-year-old Tara Calico was an early riser, known for her discipline, her laughter, and the bright pink bike she rode each morning. She left home just after 9 a.m., telling her mother she planned to ride her usual route along Highway 47, a stretch of road that ran straight through desert and farmland. She promised she'd be back by noon. They had plans to go shopping later that day. Her mother, Patty, remembered watching her pedal away. The glint of the bike in the sun, the Walkman clipped to her shorts, the faint trace of music fading as she disappeared down the road. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of morning that passes quietly in small towns. But when noon came, and Tara hadn't returned, Patty felt the first edge of worry. By afternoon, when the sky turned to a pale desert blue, she drove the route herself. On the roadside, she found pieces of a cassette tape and a small fragment of a Walkman, the same model her daughter had been using that morning. But no sign of Tara, and no sound but the dry wind moving through the weeds. That night, police began their search. Friends and neighbors combed the area with flashlights and pickup trucks, calling her name into the still desert air. Helicopters traced the roads from above, spotlights sweeping over sagebrush and empty fields. They found tire marks along the shoulder, evidence that another vehicle may have followed her that morning. But there were no witnesses, no answers, only a road stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Days turned to weeks. The investigation spread across the county, then across state lines as tips came in from nearby towns. None led anywhere certain. The desert kept its silence. For her family, the waiting became its own kind of time, marked not by calendars, but by the rhythm of phone calls and fading hope. And then, almost a year later, something surfaced that would make this case one of the most haunting mysteries in modern memory. A single photograph found hundreds of miles away, bearing the image of two people whose faces the world would never forget. That photograph would ignite one of the most far-reaching searches in FBI history, turning a local disappearance into a national enigma, a question that still echoes across the decades. The girl on the bike had vanished, but her story was not finished. Months had passed since Tara Calico's morning ride. In Belen, the posters on telephone poles had begun to fade, their edges curling from sun and dust. Her family continued to search, never allowing the case to slip into silence. Then, on June 15, 1989, nearly 9 months after her disappearance, a small event in a distant state would turn the investigation upside down. In the parking lot of a convenience store in Port St. Joe, Florida, a customer noticed a Polaroid photograph lying on the asphalt. She picked it up, brushed away the dust, and looked at an image that would soon circle the world. The photo showed a teenage girl and a young boy, both lying in the back of a white van, their wrists seemingly bound, tape across their mouths. Beside them was a paperback copy of My Sweet Audrina by V.C. Andrews. The woman who found the photo handed it to police immediately. The store was near a busy highway, and by the time officers arrived, the vehicle she described had vanished into traffic. When the photograph aired on national news, viewers across the country stared in disbelief. It was grainy and color-faded, but to many who knew Tara Calico, the resemblance was unmistakable. Her mother studied the photo for hours. The shape of the jaw, the same freckle on the leg, even the book, a title Tara had recently been reading. For investigators, the image was both a lead and a riddle. The Polaroid film used in the photograph had not been manufactured until months after Tara's disappearance, meaning it could not have been staged earlier. If it was her, it meant she had still been alive long after that September morning. The photograph was sent to the FBI lab for analysis. Experts compared facial features, even the reflection in the eyes, but could not reach a definitive conclusion. For every specialist who said it was her, another said it was not. And so, the image became an artifact of uncertainty, a single frozen moment that might contain an answer, or might only mirror the desperation of those who wanted one. Over the following months, other photographs surfaced, some similar, some unrelated, each examined, none verified. The investigation expanded through Florida, New Mexico, and beyond. No confirmed link ever surfaced. For Tara's family, hope remained complicated. Alive in one breath, impossible in the next. They continued to appear on talk shows and news specials, not for attention, but to keep her face in the public eye. The desert, however, kept its secrets. Investigators continued to follow leads into the 1990s, checking tips from people who thought they'd seen the girl from the photograph. Each call was logged, each photograph reviewed under the harsh light of the evidence room. The case never officially closed, but it also never reached resolution. As years passed, technology advanced, forensics improved, and theories multiplied. But the truth, whether Tara Calico's image lived inside that Polaroid or not, remained just beyond reach. Some mysteries move like the desert wind. They shift, cover, and reveal only what they choose. Tara's story became one of those, a puzzle made of sunlight, distance, and time. Years turned quietly into decades. The open desert south of Berlin, once mapped by search parties and helicopters, returned to stillness. Grass and wind reclaimed the roadside where Tara's pink bicycle was last seen. The case, though never solved, refused to fade. Each anniversary brought new questions, fresh theories, and the same unyielding photograph that seemed to hold the world's gaze. Investigators came and went, technology advanced, but the mystery of what happened that morning in 1988 remained exactly where it began, on that long stretch of New Mexico highway. For her mother, Patty, the search became a lifelong mission. She organized awareness campaigns, spoke with media, and worked with law enforcement to keep her daughter's name active in federal databases. Even after years passed, she maintained that Tara's story was not only about loss, but about persistence, the quiet determination to keep a promise. In the early 2000s, the case was reopened more than once. Detectives re-examined physical evidence, interviewed witnesses who had long moved away, and searched again along Highway 47 with modern tools and fresh eyes. Each attempt brought small details, but no definitive answers. In 2013, a new lead drew attention once more, and police stated that they had reason to believe Tara had likely been the victim of a hit-and-run followed by a cover-up. But even that theory rested on fragments in memory. No arrests followed, and the mystery remained unsolved. For the community of Berlin, her case became a marker of time. Older residents still point down the highway when telling her story, and every September, someone leaves a single flower near the spot where her mother once found the broken cassette tape. Tara's disappearance, like the cases of Etan Patz and Johnny Gosch before her, helped shape the landscape of modern missing person investigations. It reminded the public that even in quiet places, vigilance mattered, and that every missing person's photograph was a story still unfolding. In a way, Tara's story transcended certainty. The photograph from Port St. Joe became an icon of unresolved mystery, a symbol of the unanswered questions that linger at the edges of true crime. It speaks to the hope that evidence will one day reveal truth, and to the heartbreak of knowing that sometimes it never will. As of 2025, the investigation remains open. The FBI and Valencia County authorities continue to receive tips, each one examined with the same care as the first. The file is thick with interviews, reports, and that single Polaroid, sealed in plastic, a haunting fragment of the story that refuses to rest. Tara Calico's legacy endures not only in law enforcement manuals or archives, but in the hearts of those who remember her as she was, a bright, determined young woman pedaling down a quiet desert road, her music playing through headphones, the world wide open before her. Take a slow breath now. Let the rain steady your thoughts. The roads we travel, the memories we keep, the mysteries we hold, they remind us how fragile and how precious every ordinary day can be. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly, for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning. It was October 22nd, 1989, in St. Joseph, Minnesota, a Sunday evening after a day of cool autumn light. 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling had spent the day with his family, laughing with his brother Trevor and his friend Aaron. After dinner, they asked permission to ride their bikes to the nearby convenience store, just a short trip to rent a video and buy some candy. Their mother, Patty, hesitated for a moment. It was already dark, but the road was quiet and familiar. She agreed, telling them to wear reflective gear and to be home soon. They left just before 9 p.m., their flashlight beams bouncing along the rural road, the night air crisp and filled with the scent of harvested fields. The boys reached the store, picked out a movie, Return of the Jedi, and started home. They rode single file, the lights of the small town fading behind them. It was a night like any other in rural Minnesota. The sound of crickets, the distant hum of engines on Highway 52, and the rhythm of bicycle tires on gravel. But halfway home, on a stretch of road lined with tall trees and open fields, a man appeared from the shadows. The encounter lasted only moments. The man ordered the boys off their bikes, asked their ages, and told two of them to run. They did, and when they looked back, Jacob was gone. The two boys sprinted home in panic, bursting through the door, gasping out what had happened. Within minutes, police were called, and the first patrol cars sped down that dark rural road. Officers found 3 bicycles abandoned in the ditch, their wheels slowly turning in the wind. It was the beginning of a search that would stretch across the nation. Helicopters and mounted officers scoured cornfields and forests. Divers searched the nearby Sauk River. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder with flashlights, calling Jacob's name into the cold night air. The community of St. Joseph, a place built on trust and routine, suddenly found itself at the center of a nightmare it could barely comprehend. By morning, the story was on every news broadcast in Minnesota. Within days, it was national. A smiling photograph of an 11-year-old boy in a red jersey appeared on television screens across the country. And for the next 27 years, that photograph would remain in evidence rooms, on bulletin boards, and in the hearts of those who never stopped searching. The small town of St. Joseph would never be the same. Neither would America. That October night changed everything for St. Joseph. Neighbors, who had always left doors unlocked, began to check the windows twice. Parents walked children to school instead of watching from the porch. And through it all, search parties fanned out from the Wetterling home in widening circles, through fields, along the Sauk River, and down the gravel road where 3 bicycles had been found. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers joined law enforcement. Helicopters swept low with infrared sensors. Divers probed ponds and drainage ditches. Officers rode horseback through dense brush. But the landscape offered nothing back. No footprints, no clothing, no sound. By dawn, reporters had gathered at the edge of the cordoned road, their cameras glinting in the frost. The photograph of Jacob, brown hair, bright eyes, red jersey, was broadcast across every Minnesota channel by sunrise. For days, the search continued around the clock. The FBI joined the case, and a mobile command post was set up near the Wetterling home. Maps covered every wall. Each new tip was marked in red. More than 50,000 leads would be logged over the years that followed, yet each one ended the same way: checked, rechecked, and crossed off. Weeks passed, and then months. Winter crept across the prairie. The fields froze hard and silent. The posters began to weather in the wind, but no one took them down. In grocery stores, at gas pumps, in school hallways, Jacob's face became a symbol of something larger than one town's grief. The Wetterling family refused to let the search fade. They spoke at community meetings, organized volunteer centers, and pressed for new ways to track and coordinate missing child investigations. Patty Wetterling, Jacob's mother, soon became one of the most recognizable advocates in the country, her calm voice urging change rather than anger. Her message was simple: every child deserves to be found. In 1994, 5 years after that night, her efforts led to the passage of the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children Act, the first federal law to require states to maintain registries of convicted sex offenders. It was not the answer she had wanted, but it ensured that Jacob's name would stand for prevention as well as loss. Meanwhile, investigators continued their work. Suspects were interviewed, polygraphs administered, theories built and dismantled. Technology advanced, DNA testing improved. Every new tool was applied to the aging evidence. Yet nothing led them to Jacob. For nearly 3 decades, his photograph remained on billboards and in police training manuals, a constant reminder of the promise that had not yet been kept. Then, In 2016, 27 years after the night he vanished, the search finally ended. A man already in prison for other crimes confessed and led investigators to a quiet pasture near Paynesville, just a few miles from the Wetterling home. Forensic teams worked carefully, methodically. The remains were confirmed through dental records. Jacob had been found. The truth brought grief, but also something like peace, the long waiting replaced by certainty. The community gathered for vigils, candles flickering in the cool September wind, each flame a small echo of the hope that had carried them through the years. From that night in 1989 to the moment of resolution in 2016, an entire generation had grown up under Jacob's shadow, learning what it meant to search, to protect, to remember. The boy who disappeared on a quiet country road had changed the way the world thought about safety and law, about compassion and resilience. The story of Jacob Wetterling is both heartbreak and hope, a reminder that even in the longest shadows, compassion can light the way forward. What began as a quiet Sunday night in a Minnesota town became the spark that changed how an entire nation protects its children. The search for Jacob led to new laws, new databases, and the creation of tools that now save lives every year. It reshaped how police coordinate, how communities communicate, and how quickly the world responds when a child goes missing. In 2016, when investigators finally brought answers home, the Wetterling family asked the world to remember Jacob not for the horror of his loss, but for the kindness he represented, a kindness they believed everyone carries within them. They spoke of forgiveness, of gratitude for those who searched, and of the belief that good can still rise from tragedy. Patty Wetterling said it best: "We're still Jacob's parents, and he's still our teacher." Today, the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center continues that mission. It trains law enforcement, educates families, and helps survivors and their loved ones find safety and voice. Each program, each seminar, each moment of prevention is part of Jacob's enduring legacy. In St. Joseph, a memorial garden now stands near the site of his disappearance. Visitors leave notes, flowers, and tokens, symbols of both remembrance and renewal. On certain evenings, when the air is still and the rain drifts gently across the prairie, the sound of wind through the trees feels almost like a whisper. We're still looking out for one another. Jacob's story is more than a case solved. It's the story of how people refuse to give up, how a family's strength became a blueprint for change, and how a small community's heartbreak transformed into a national promise. A promise that no missing child's name will ever be forgotten. The rain falls softly now, as if carrying that promise across the dark, each drop a quiet vow, each echo a reminder that from sorrow, light can still grow. Take a slow breath, detective. Let the story rest now. The road is quiet again, the fields still, the stars above St. Joseph, bright as they were that October night. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly, for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning. It was June 5th, 2002. In the Smart family's home, the evening had been ordinary and warm. The children had said their prayers, the windows were open to the cool mountain air, and the city lights shimmered faintly below the hills. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart slept in her bed beside her younger sister, Mary Catherine. The room was quiet, the kind of peace only summer nights seemed to carry. Sometime after 2 a.m., that quiet was broken. A figure entered the house through an open window. He carried a knife and whispered Elizabeth's name. Her sister, half asleep, thought she was dreaming. Then she heard footsteps, soft at first, then fading away through the hall, down the stairs, and out into the dark. When morning came, Elizabeth was gone. The Smart family called 911 at dawn. Within hours, officers filled the neighborhood. Dogs followed scent trails that vanished near the edge of the yard, and helicopters circled the foothills. their searchlights tracing patterns across the trees. Neighbors gathered in driveways, holding coffee cups and disbelief. The Smart family's home, bright, familiar, ordinary, became the center of a vast and urgent search. The first few days were filled with motion, checkpoints, interviews, and endless questions. Volunteers stapled posters to telephone poles, each bearing Elizabeth's school photograph, long blonde hair, a calm, steady smile. Her parents, Ed and Lois Smart, spoke to the cameras with grace and clarity, pleading for her safe return. They refused to let despair speak louder than hope. Days turned to weeks. Officers followed hundreds of tips, from distant states to nearby canyons. The Utah summer grew hotter, and yet the search continued, a pattern of helicopters by day and candlelight vigils by night. In one of those vigils, her father stood before a silent crowd and said, "Elizabeth, if you can hear us, we're coming for you. We will never stop." Those words became the heartbeat of the search. Every missing person bulletin, every volunteer, every moment of quiet determination carried that same promise. And then, 9 long months later, on an ordinary March afternoon, a miracle happened. 2 hikers near Sandy, Utah, recognized a young woman walking with 2 adults. She was wearing a veil, her face mostly hidden, but something in her eyes, in her quiet presence, felt familiar. Police arrived quickly. When they asked her name, she spoke softly. "I'm Elizabeth Smart." After 9 months in captivity, she was alive, calm, dignified, and ready to return home. The story that had begun in darkness found its way back to light. When the news broke that Elizabeth Smart had been found alive, it spread through Salt Lake City like sunrise. Neighbors cried openly. Reporters who had covered the search for months stood speechless on air. After so much time, after so many false leads, the story had found its way home. The reunion between Elizabeth and her family was private, away from cameras. She was quiet at first, carefully held by those who had refused to give up on her. Doctors examined her, detectives took statements, but the focus of that first day was not evidence. It was love. Within hours, investigators identified the 2 people who had been with her: Brian David Mitchell, a drifter who had once worked briefly at the Smart home, and Wanda Barzee, his wife and accomplice. Mitchell had been the man who entered the house that June night, guided by delusion and control. He and Barzee had kept Elizabeth hidden in the canyons east of the city, living in a makeshift camp that blended with the trees. When she was found, Elizabeth was 14 no longer, but she had endured, outlasting fear with quiet strength. The trial would come years later, and though the details were painful, Elizabeth chose to face them directly. She testified with clarity and composure, describing her ordeal not to relive it, but to ensure that no one else would ever suffer as she had. Her words in court were calm and measured, a mirror of her resilience. When the verdict was read, both Mitchell and Barzee were convicted and sentenced. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. But perhaps the more powerful part of her story is what came next. Instead of retreating from the world, Elizabeth began to speak publicly, first cautiously, then as a steady, compassionate voice for others. She founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, focused on recovery, prevention, and survivor support. Through her work, she reminded people that healing was not only possible, but necessary, that a life interrupted could still become whole again. In interviews, she often spoke not of the crime itself, but of the moment she was found, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the ordinary sound of traffic in the distance, the relief of recognizing the world again. It was as if life itself had gently reached out and taken her hand. For her family, the years that followed were about gratitude. The house where she had once vanished became a symbol not of fear, but of faith restored. Each Christmas, the Smarts placed an extra candle in the window, not only for Elizabeth, but for every missing child still out there, waiting to be found. The story of Elizabeth Smart had begun as tragedy, but it had returned as testament, a reminder of how the will to survive can be stronger than the darkest night. Some stories return to light not through justice alone, but through the strength of the people who choose to live on. Elizabeth Smart's story is one of those rare moments when survival becomes something larger than itself. A lesson, a legacy, a quiet call for compassion. When she speaks today, her voice carries the calm of someone who has already faced the worst and chosen peace instead of bitterness. She reminds the world that healing is not forgetting. It's reclaiming the power once taken away. Through her foundation and advocacy, she meets with families of missing children, helping them find the balance between hope and acceptance. Each time an Amber Alert flashes across a phone screen, each time law enforcement uses a recovery protocol refined by her experience, a small piece of her story ripples outward, quiet proof that survival can transform policy and that empathy can become action. For the people of Salt Lake City, the hills that once hid so much pain now stand as a reminder of endurance. Hikers who pass through those trails still lower their voices, still remember the girl who came home from the shadows. And for families everywhere, Elizabeth's name has become a shorthand for possibility, for the idea that even after months, even after silence, light can still find its way through. The story changed the way investigators search, the way communities react, and the way media approaches missing person cases. But beyond all that, it changed how people saw survivors themselves, not as victims frozen in time, but as voices that continue, strong and steady, long after the headlines fade. In interviews, Elizabeth once said, "What happened to me will always be part of my life, but it doesn't define who I am." And in that sentence lies the quiet truth of every missing child's story. That identity is more than what was taken. It's what we choose to rebuild. So as the rain falls softly now, remember that even among the darkest cases, there are those who return, and with them, the chance for light, for change, for new beginnings. Take a slow breath, detective. Let the quiet settle around you. The storm has passed, and for once, the story ends not in silence, but in survival. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly, for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning. It was June 10th, 1991, in South Lake Tahoe, California. The morning sun had just touched the peaks, and 12-year-old Jaycee Lee Dugard stepped out of her home wearing a pink jacket and a shy smile. She lived with her mother, Terry, and her stepfather in a neighborhood hugged by pine trees and mountain air. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other from driveways, where children walked freely to meet the bus at the corner. Jaycee left a few minutes early that morning. Her cat followed her to the end of the driveway, as it often did, before settling in the grass to watch her go. It was just after 7:45 a.m. Neighbors heard a car approach, then a sharp cry, and the screech of tires on asphalt. By the time her stepfather reached the street, the car was already gone, a gray sedan disappearing around the bend. He jumped on his bicycle and gave chase, pedaling hard until the road curved out of sight. But the car was gone, and with it, Jaycee. Police arrived within minutes. Roadblocks were set up, helicopters scanned the wooded hills, and the quiet town that had seemed so safe suddenly felt like a place where anything could happen. Officers combed through brush and creeks. Canine teams searched along the road. They found Jaycee's school bag in the grass, its contents scattered, but nothing else. The investigation stretched deep into the woods and into nearby Nevada, each day beginning with new hope and ending in silence. Leads came from across the state, cars that matched descriptions, sightings that never held. For Jaycee's family, Days blurred into weeks, and weeks into years. Her photograph, a child's bright face framed by blonde hair, became a fixture on bulletin boards and television screens. The world moved on, but her mother never did. 18 years would pass before anyone heard her name spoken in the present tense again. 18 years. And then, in the heat of a California August, a miracle quietly unfolded at a university campus in Berkeley. A young woman walked into the sunlight, shy, composed, and carrying a story the world had long stopped expecting to hear. Her name was Jaycee Lee Dugard, and she was alive. 18 years is a lifetime. For Jaycee's family, those years had been a long stretch of unanswered days, a calendar filled with anniversaries, vigils, and questions that never found rest. When the call came, in August of 2009, the voice on the line trembled with disbelief. "We think we've found her." That morning, 2 campus officers at the University of California, Berkeley, had stopped a man who was behaving strangely with 2 young girls. His name was Philip Garrido. He spoke in tangents, a mix of charm and confusion that caught the officers' attention. When they asked who the girls were, he said they were his daughters, but their quiet glances and careful silence told another story. The officers grew suspicious and called his parole officer. When Garrido returned to the office the next day, he brought the girls and a woman who called herself Alyssa. She was calm, composed, polite, but there was something else, something behind her eyes, a quiet that seemed to hold years of words unsaid. As the officers spoke with her, the pieces began to shift into place. Her story emerged slowly, hesitant but certain, and then, at last, she said it. "My name is Jaycee Lee Dugard." 18 years after she disappeared, she was free. Her mother, Terry, received the news that afternoon. She said the world seemed to stop and then to rush forward all at once. When they finally reunited, it was quiet. No cameras, no reporters, just 2 lives meeting again after years apart. In that small room, a sentence that had been frozen in time since 1991 finally completed itself. She came home. Over the following weeks, investigators pieced together the full story, how Jaycee had been kept hidden in a backyard compound, how she had survived through courage and the will to protect her 2 daughters. Her resilience astonished those who met her. She had not only endured, she had nurtured life, hope, and humanity in the quietest of prisons. When the trial came, Philip and Nancy Garrido were convicted and sentenced. Jaycee did not attend in person. She didn't need to. Her existence, her freedom, was the final verdict. In the years that followed, she chose to reclaim her voice. Through her memoir, A Stolen Life, and through the Jaycee Foundation, she began helping others heal, families of abducted children, and survivors learning to navigate the world again. Her message was steady, simple, and filled with grace. What happened to me was only part of my story. The rest is mine to write. From silence to sunlight, her journey became a map of resilience, a living reminder that endurance is not just survival. It's choosing to live fully, even after the unimaginable. Some stories remind us that even after the longest silence, the human spirit can still find its voice. Jaycee Lee Dugard's story is one of those rare lights, born from darkness, carried by endurance, and finally set free by her own strength. When she first returned home, there was no great announcement, no dramatic moment for the cameras. It was simple. A family reunited, a mother holding her daughter, a promise kept after 18 long years, the house filled with laughter again, and for the first time since 1991, the sound of an ordinary life returned to the quiet corners of their world. In the months that followed, Jaycee began to write, not to relive what had been taken, but to reclaim it. Her words were honest, without bitterness. She wrote about fear, yes, but also about the beauty of small things, the sun on her face, the freedom of walking outside without permission, the sound of her daughter's laughter. Through her foundation, she now helps others learn to rebuild their own lives. Workshops on trauma recovery, training for law enforcement, resources for families still waiting. Each act of service a quiet ripple of compassion, and yet her story is not just about what she endured, it's about what she became. A voice for survivors, a reminder that even after years lost to darkness, life does not end. It begins again in new form. For the world, Jaycee's recovery became a kind of proof that hope, no matter how long deferred, can still be rewarded. That even after nearly 2 decades, a missing person's case can end not in mourning, but in light. In interviews, she often says she doesn't want to be defined by her captivity, but by her freedom. And perhaps that's what gives her story its peace. The way she has turned survival into purpose, and memory into meaning. Her name has come to represent something larger, not tragedy, but transformation. When you listen to the rain tonight, think of that morning in the mountains of Tahoe, the road lined with pines, the cat waiting in the grass. Think of how far she traveled to come home again. And remember that sometimes, even when the world forgets to look, the light still finds its way through. Take a slow breath, detective. The storm has passed, and in its wake, a quiet kind of courage remains. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly, for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning. It began in August 2002 when 21-year-old Michelle Knight disappeared on her way to a court appointment. Her family searched, but when days passed without news, the case faded quietly into the city's background noise. She was young, independent, and struggling, and in that silence, her absence went largely unnoticed. A year later, in April 2003, 16-year-old Amanda Berry vanished the day before her birthday. She was walking home from her job at a Burger King, just a few blocks from where Michelle had last been seen. Her disappearance made headlines. Flyers covered telephone poles. Her mother appeared on television, pleading for help. Then, nearly a year later, in April 2004, 14-year-old Gina DeJesus failed to return home from school. She and Amanda had been friends. Her family searched the same streets, knocked on the same doors, and placed the same missing posters along the same telephone poles. 3 disappearances, all within blocks of one another, and all, as it would later be known, connected by a single address on Seymour Avenue. For years, those families lived in a pattern of hope and heartbreak. Each new tip reopened the wound. Each unconfirmed sighting sent them searching again. Amanda's mother passed away before learning the truth, still holding to the belief that her daughter was alive. Meanwhile, inside that unassuming house, life continued, hidden from the world, but not extinguished. The 3 young women had found in one another a kind of endurance. They survived through small acts of defiance and care, teaching, comforting, protecting. In the darkest circumstances, they created their own fragile community of strength. And outside, neighbors mowed lawns, children played in yards, and the seasons changed again and again. No one knew that, behind the walls of that ordinary home, 3 missing girls were still alive, waiting for the day the door would finally open. It would take more than 10 years for that moment to come. But when it did, it would begin not with an investigator, but with a cry for help that echoed through a neighborhood and changed everything. It was May 6th, 2013, an ordinary spring afternoon on Seymour Avenue. Neighbors were outside, the sound of music and conversation spilling into the warm air. Among them was a man named Charles Ramsey, finishing his meal when he heard a sound, a woman's voice, faint but urgent, calling for help from inside the house next door. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a child's prank, until he heard it again. "Help me, please. I'm Amanda Berry." The name froze him in place. He'd seen that name on missing posters for years. He ran toward the sound, finding a door locked from the inside. With another neighbor's help, he kicked through the lower panel. A young woman crawled out, clutching a small child, her daughter, born during her years in captivity. Amanda Berry was alive, and in her arms, hope itself seemed to breathe again. Once outside, she called 911, her voice shaking, but clear. "Help me. I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped, and I've been missing for 10 years. I'm free now." Within minutes, police flooded Seymour Avenue. They entered the home cautiously, and there, in the dim light of locked rooms, they found Gina, DeJesus, and Michelle Knight. 3 missing women, gone for more than a decade, now standing in the doorway of freedom. News spread through Cleveland like lightning. Crowds gathered on the street, crying, cheering, praying. Officers escorted the survivors to safety, and for the first time in years, the word missing was replaced with found. Inside the house, investigators found evidence of confinement, a grim reflection of how long the 3 had been held. But outside, the air was filled not with horror, but with relief. The neighbors, the families, the entire city had been waiting for this sound. Voices no longer silenced. The man responsible, Ariel Castro, was arrested that same day. He was later sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, his house demolished soon after, a quiet lot left behind, where grass would one day grow again. For Amanda, Gina, and Michelle, the road to healing was long, but it began that afternoon, in the sunlight of a Cleveland street, with a single cry for help and the kindness of a neighbor who refused to ignore it. Sometimes the loudest rescues begin in the quietest moments, and sometimes, after years of darkness, light arrives all at once. For over 10 years, an ordinary house in Cleveland had hidden 3 extraordinary survivors, and when they finally walked free, their story became not just a rescue, but a reminder that even when years pass in silence, courage can still find a voice. Pause for a sec. Piano, soft arpeggio. In the days that followed the rescue, the world watched in awe as Amanda, Gina, and Michelle began the long process of reclaiming their lives. They reunited with family, spoke quietly with detectives, and began the slow, steady work of healing. Michelle Knight, the first taken and the one missing from the headlines for so long, chose a new name, Lily Rose Lee, a symbol of rebirth and growth. She wrote, "They tried to bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed. Rain steady, piano gentle repetition. Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus, once friends separated by fate, became advocates for others still missing. Together, they helped launch a Cleveland Missing Persons Initiative, designed to make sure no family ever waited so long for answers again. They used their own experiences to guide police training, to support families, and to remind the world that the word survivor means far more than victim." Pause, 5 sec. Piano low, reflective chord. For the city of Cleveland, the house on Seymour Avenue no longer stands. Where it once loomed in shadow, there is now open sky, a quiet lot where grass sways and children play. The space is empty, but in that emptiness there's peace. It is a scar turned into a garden. Rain-soft background, piano transitions to warm major tones. In interviews, Amanda, Gina, and Michelle have all spoken about forgiveness, not for the one who harmed them, but for themselves, for learning to live without anger. Their voices, calm and steady, carry a strength that no darkness could erase. And when Amanda Berry was asked what freedom felt like, she said simply, "It feels like sunlight." Pause, 6 sec. Piano, soft chord, sustains. Their story stands among the most powerful of modern times, a testament not to cruelty, but to endurance, friendship, and the will to keep living when the world forgets where you are. They remind us that survival isn't just returning home. It's learning to be whole again, to breathe again, to love again. Rain slows to a drizzle. Piano begins quiet, closing motif. So tonight, as the rain fades beyond the window, think of that small Cleveland street and the courage that bloomed there. A house once filled with silence, now remembered only for the sound of a door breaking open and a voice shouting, "Help me." Rain softens further. Piano, gentle resolution. Take a slow breath, detective. Let the quiet settle. This story, too, ends in light. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence, true crime told softly for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning. It was January 26, 1966, Australia Day, a public holiday filled with sunshine and celebration. At 10 a.m., Jane, age 9, Arna, age 7, and Grant Beaumont, age 4, left their family home in Somerton Park, a quiet suburb not far from Glenelg Beach. Their mother, Nancy, watched them go. Their father, Jim, was working in town. The children were familiar with the short bus ride to the beach. They had taken it many times before. It was only a 5-minute trip, and Jane, the eldest, was responsible, polite, and punctual. They promised to be home by lunchtime. The morning passed quietly. It was a perfect summer day. Clear skies, soft waves, the kind of warmth that makes every sound seem to shimmer. Witnesses remembered seeing the 3 children laughing near the shoreline, playing in the sand, chasing one another with the joy that comes so easily to youth. Around noon, they were seen again, buying pastries at a nearby bakery. The shopkeeper noticed how comfortable they seemed, how they smiled, spoke easily, and mentioned they were getting lunch for themselves and the man. That detail, small at the time, would later become the thread that unraveled everything. When 2 p.m. arrived and the children still hadn't returned, Nancy Beaumont began to worry. By mid-afternoon, she called neighbors, then police. The search began before sunset. Officers combed the beach, questioned bus drivers, and walked through every nearby park and shop. By nightfall, the shoreline that had been filled with laughter that morning was silent except for the sound of waves and radios crackling with updates. The children were gone. Within hours, the quiet seaside suburb transformed into a center of urgency. Volunteers and officers searched through dunes, vacant lots, storm drains, and nearby houses. But there was no trace, no footprints, no clothing, no answers. The disappearance of 3 children from a busy beach in broad daylight seemed unthinkable. In the following days, newspapers across Australia printed their photographs. 3 smiling faces, 3 simple names. The country, young, optimistic, and still finding its identity, was shaken in a way it had never been before. Something in the nation's sense of safety changed that week, and though decades would pass, no one would ever truly stop searching for Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont. As night fell over Adelaide, the coastline glowed with searchlights. Police officers, volunteers, and neighbors walked shoulder to shoulder across the sand dunes, calling the children's names into the warm air. For hours, the only answers were the sound of surf and the hiss of wind through the grass. By dawn, the search had grown to hundreds of people. Helicopters circled above. Boats scanned the shallows near the pier. Reporters gathered, their headlines already calling it the Glenelg Mystery. The Beaumont parents waited by the phone, their house filled with police maps and kind strangers bringing food. Nancy clutched a list of things the children had taken, a few coins for the bus, a towel, a paperback book Jane had been reading. None of it would ever be found. Witnesses came forward, each offering fragments of memory. Several people recalled seeing the children with a tall, blond man, smiling, playing, someone who seemed friendly, even familiar. The children appeared comfortable around him. He was never identified. The newspapers printed his description day after day. Tips flooded in, sightings, rumors, theories, each one leading investigators a few steps forward, then nowhere at all. As the days passed, the search became one of the largest in Australian history. Detectives interviewed bus drivers, scoured hotels and boarding houses, even dug through sand dunes and abandoned wells. No evidence ever surfaced. By the end of the first week, the case had captured the world's attention. International newspapers sent reporters to Glenelg, and television broadcasts described it as a nation's innocence lost. For years afterward, new leads would come and go, each bringing hope, each ending in silence. Letters claiming knowledge of the children's fate, anonymous phone calls, and witnesses convinced they'd seen them in distant towns. None could be verified. Through it all, Jim and Nancy Beaumont never stopped searching. They moved homes to escape the daily reminders, but never left Adelaide entirely. Each anniversary brought renewed headlines, and with them, renewed pain. Police built vast case files filled with interviews, sketches, and aerial photos of the beach. Each page a map of uncertainty. Decades would pass, new investigators taking up the case, new technology applied to old evidence. There were excavations, theories about suspects, and even confessions that led nowhere. But no matter how much the world changed, the mystery of the Beaumont children remained untouched, a story suspended in time. And in a way, it became more than just a case. It became a symbol of how fragile trust can be, how quickly an ordinary day can fracture, and how a nation, once carefree, learned to watch the world a little differently. The beach at Glenelg is still beautiful. Families still gather there. Children still play near the waves. But the sound of the tide carries something quiet underneath, a memory that never left. Time moves differently for stories that never find an ending. For the Beaumont family, the years passed in silence. Each season, a question unanswered. Each new day, a hope that perhaps someone, somewhere, would finally remember something that mattered. More than half a century has now passed since that bright summer morning in 1966. The world has changed beyond recognition, but in Australia, the name Beaumont still carries a weight, a hush, a reminder of innocence lost too soon. The case reshaped an entire nation's sense of safety. Parents began keeping their children closer, schools taught caution instead of trust, and police around the world began developing the systems and procedures we now take for granted when a child goes missing. Out of heartbreak, modern child protection was born. In Adelaide, the case remains open. Detectives still review the evidence, following the trail wherever it leads. Over the decades, forensic tools, ground scans, and DNA testing have all been used to search for traces of the 3 children. Yet the answer, if it still exists, lies somewhere beneath the years, just out of reach. For Jim and Nancy Beaumont, the pain became a quiet companion. They lived private lives, avoiding interviews, carrying their memories with the dignity of people who had once been ordinary parents and were never allowed to be again. Even as time eroded details, their love for Jane, Arna, and Grant never dimmed. Each generation since has grown up hearing their story, not as folklore or ghost tale, but as something sacred, a reminder to hold each other close, to look twice, to never take safety for granted. And for all its sadness, the Beaumont story has also become a quiet symbol of persistence, of communities that refuse to forget, of investigators who still, after nearly 60 years, keep the case file open on their desks. On Glenelg Beach, the sea moves the same way it did that morning, waves folding gently over the sand, the horizon endless, the air filled with children's laughter once more. And in that sound, there's something almost healing, a reminder that joy, though fragile, always returns, Some mysteries remain unsolved. But remembrance, too, is a kind of justice. It says, "You were here. You mattered. We have not forgotten." Take a slow breath, detective. The rain is easing now, the night soft around us. The sea keeps its secrets, but the memory remains. Quiet, steadfast, eternal. You've been listening to Midnight Evidence. True crime told softly for those who wander and for those who dream. Sleep well, detective. The case will keep until morning.